Hi, this is Dr. Barnes. I've been wanting to share this presentation with y'all for a while. I was doing some supervision the other day, and I was talking with someone about theory of practice, and one of the things that they had said was that they really wanted to learn to use various theories in a more intentional way. And I know I've talked with each of the clinicians about theory of practice over the course of the last couple months and had promised to share this information. So I thought it was time to get this out to you. And as you can see, this was a class that I had developed when I was on the faculty at the University of Colorado in Denver in their counseling program. And I taught advanced theory and techniques. And, that's so much a part of that class was to help students begin to develop their own theory of practice so that when they get out and get into their internships, that they're really like learning and kind of honing their skills. So I developed this class as a way to really simplify the process for them. So I think it's important to start this presentation with a discussion of the difference between eclecticism and clinical integration. And I always tell the story of when I was in my master's program, and I think it was a personality class, and the professor walked in and said, we're going to go around the room, and each of you is going to talk a little bit about your kind of theory of practice and how you conceptualize therapy. And I was thinking to myself, well, I'm pretty eclectic. I kind of pick and choose and use various models as I think appropriate and as I think is needed. And so I was sitting in the second seat. The guy in front of me started the discussion by saying he was eclectic, and the professor just went off on him and said, who do you think you are? You think you're not smart enough to be eclectic. You know everything about every model, and you can pick and choose the perfect time to use those. And I very quickly decided that I'm cognitive behavioral. I could explain that theory pretty well. And that was really a very powerful discussion for me, the idea of, if you're not eclectic, then what are you? And so I began to look at kind of integrated models of practice. And when I got to Florida State for my doctoral program, that was such a big part of our program, was that every student who graduated from the program would leave with a very integrated theory of practice, that we could explain why we did interventions and what was the underlying kind of rationale for using this theory as opposed to that theory. And so I think it's really important that when I speak to you about what is your theory of practice, I'm really as interested in kind of what is your underlying theoretical belief? What are your assumptions about clinical issues that allow you to be consistent in using the right interventions at the right times? And so if you look at the slide, building an integrated model is building around a theoretical approach, a unifying theory or a set of assumptions. It implies that you as a therapist have an understanding of the active ingredients of therapy, what is actually needed to address the various diagnoses that we work with. And then that you've integrated a variety of theoretical models that actually are consistent with your beliefs about the change process and the growth process. So our goal is not eclecticism. Our goal is to be kind of very integrated in our thought processes. The next slide comes from a book called Becoming an Effective Psychotherapist. It was written by a guy by the name of Truscott. And I liked the model, I liked the book because it helps kind of emerging therapists and even very seasoned therapists to begin to identify what it is that they do and how do they view the world from a really nice model. And the model is built on these sort of kind of crossing paths that regarding reality, which it's either objective meaning it can be measured, or it's subjective, meaning it's, and not only is objective measured, it means that I as a therapist can look at what you tell me and decide whether it's healthy or not healthy, whether it's functional or dysfunctional, or whether it's rational or irrational, as opposed to subjective reality, where we begin to look at how does a person's reality either keep them stuck in a problem, and if we can help them begin to shift their belief systems, kind of move them into solution, as opposed to kind of diagnostic and collaborative would be the difference in those approaches. And whether it's going to be analytic, meaning I am the expert, or experiential, and that the client is the expert, and our job is really to help them begin to experience their reality in a way that either promotes change or promotes staying the same. And so if we take Truscott's kind of 4 quadrants and we begin to look at empiricism and the idea that values relational thoughts, and it applies to objective experience, and the idea of again, objective experience is what can be observed and what can be measured, kind of similar to traditional science. Human behavior is the result of learning and situation-specific forces. The idea that it's kind of, there's a baseline. We intervene on the behaviors or the thoughts, and then we kind of do a second measurement, and we can begin to see, is there change? Has this person gotten better? So I think the important things is the belief that we are going to replace irrational thoughts with rational thoughts, and that the therapist is actually serving a role as a technical consultant. And so my personal beliefs are much more in the constructivist side, in that what appears to be incredibly irrational thoughts for some individuals, that when you actually begin to dissect or collaborate with that individual, particularly individuals with trauma, that what appears at first sight to be irrational is really quite rational based on the experiences of that individual. And so I would not challenge you, but ask you to take a look at this issue of assessment, this issue of analytics, to say rational versus irrational, healthy versus unhealthy, functional versus dysfunctional, as opposed to the other side, rationalism, where values rational thought apply to subjective experience. Why does a person have a set of cognitive beliefs, and where do they come from? Again, as a trauma therapist and as an addiction therapist, and the more I look at epigenetics and ecosystemic thinking and ecosystemic experience, that this sort of rational side, this constructivist existential belief system, becomes much more a part of my belief system. So self-reflection is a means of greater understanding. Human life is limited and limitations are accepted. The idea that there are certain kind of both objective and subjective realities about what's possible. And from this quadrant, the client and the therapist engage in a search for understanding of old meanings and a creation of new. And so that it's a much more collaborative process, where this is a much more evaluative process. So introspective, subjective, being skeptical, being questioning, being curious is a part of that. The 4th quadrant, humanism, person-centered therapy, Gestalt therapy, values growth-promoting subjective experiences. How does an individual's experience of their world influence what they believe, how they behave, who they are? Assumes people are intrinsically motivated towards development, growth, and socially constructive behaviors. Looking at the good in all clients. We'll talk about motivation in a few minutes, and looking at what are people motivated to do. Problems are seen as opportunities for evaluation of self, rather than as diagnostic kind of biological processes. The therapist is an empathic contact that fosters self-acceptance, self-understanding, and the importance of the therapeutic relationship. When I was a professor and I was the clinical coordinator, I did a lot of practicum and internship classes, and very often students would really base their theory of practice on person-centered thinking. And very often they would say, well, I'm person-centered and I'm cognitive behavioral. Well, if you look at that, those two theories are diametrically opposed in terms of their worldview. Cognitive behavioral being much more empiricist, the idea of irrational beliefs, and person-centered being much more experiential, the idea that we believe what we believe based on our experiences, and that they may or may not be irrational. They may be quite rational. And then the fourth quadrant is more of a collectivist, looking more at systemic theories, family therapy, feminist therapy, values growth, promoting objective experiences with others. The idea that there is a family or collective objective reality for most families. There is a kind of collective objective experience within feminist therapy. So metaphor of more complex, integrated organic processes that sort of grow and evolve towards a healthier functioning. So again, looking much more from the objectivist side. Assumes that the social context gives life meaning and purpose, and that people and groups are active, purposeful, autonomous, creative, and integrated into social matrix. And actually, the more we interact with specific groups, the more our thoughts change, the more our behaviors change, the more our realities change. And the more we can begin to say, you're either within my social circle or you're not within my social circle. I mean, if we look at the current political kind of structure within the United States, it could not be any more kind of a collectivist reality. So from a therapeutic perspective, change happens within the system. And if we can get the old belief that if we can get one member of a system to begin to change, that it challenges the system to take a look at its own kind of belief systems. So challenging unhealthy social roles, sexism, racism, and stereotypes. And so I would ask you to think for a moment, where do you fall within these belief systems? And if you have any question about that, I've included, this was kind of an assessment that Truscott included in his textbook that would ask you to read each of these and kind of score where you fall in that you don't believe in that at all, or you completely believe that. And the score that you give yourself, if you go to the next slide, in the empirical side, you would kind of put a little dot in this quadrant, or in the rationalism side, you may be a 3, and so you're out here. Humanism, you may be like fully on board, so you're out here. So you begin to build a kind of matrix of where you fall within each of these perspectives. And so the areas that you have the most space would be the theories that you would probably most align yourselves with. So I think it's just a really nice kind of beginning, kind of relatively thoughtful way to get you to begin to look at, there's all the potential of all of these theories that you could pick, which ones are actually more in line with your personal beliefs. And if you look at the last slide in this PowerPoint, and this is the slide that we're going to use throughout the rest of this discussion, it's a model that I developed because I really found that students had a hard time identifying theories that fit who they are. And again, we want to talk about being coherent or being consistent with our theory of practice is consistent with who we are as people. And I really believe that our clients, I always say our clients are assessing us far more than we're assessing them. And so any form of inconsistency or incoherence that they can detect in us actually creates distance between us and the therapeutic process, or roadblocks in the development of the therapeutic relationship. And so I really began to look at, how do you start this process? And you start the process through a pretty rigorous process of self-assessment and looking at your own assumptive world, which is kind of what we were talking about in this slide, is very much kind of the beginnings of this. And I see this as a circular process, that our assumptive worldview, how we understand reality, how we understand information processing, human nature, etc., how we understand the clinical worldview, the role of the therapist, the therapeutic relationship, and our theory of change. How do we understand the process or the role of both change and growth in the clinical process? It really starts very young, very early in our lives. They're tied to our personal values, our cultural influences, our ecosystemic influences. So often students would say, I want to practice psychotherapy kind of like my own personal therapist practiced it. And so there is a level of consistency or comfort in that process. So I would challenge you that before you get into theories, that you take a look at, where do you fall within this primary circle. And so when I was at Florida State, I had a professor by the name of Tom Smith. He was in the School of Social Work, and he challenged us with a series of questions that kind of began the process of looking at those three areas of kind of assumptive worldview. And so these questions were his. I've kind of evolved them over the course of time, and I used these at the beginning of my kind of advanced technique class, and we can go through them pretty quickly. The first is, how do you understand and explain client problems? What causes them, and in my mind, way more importantly, is what maintains them. And are client problems biological? Are they psychological? Are they social? The more we understand, as a trauma therapist, I spend so much time with epigenetics and this idea of transgenerational transmission of problems. There's a really good book called It Didn't Start With You. I can't remember who wrote it. But the idea that many of the problems that you have today, if you were to look back at your family of origin, you would see the origins of those problems as part of the system that you grew up in. And what maintains them may very well be the kind of neuroscience, the neural networks that you developed in that process of attachment and that process of connecting with others. And so, excuse me, I would challenge you to take a step back and look at, are you an objectivist or are you a subjectivist? How do you understand how problems are formed? Think of addiction. I mean, very much it's a disease, right? A lot of people don't think it's a disease. So where do you fall in that perspective? And if it is a disease, then from a cause perspective, we would believe that if we look at the process of, the dopamine glutamate connection and how cues and cravings are developed over the course of time, and neurological changes over the course of time with addiction, and how much of those neurological changes happened in childhood from growing up in a family where there was addiction. So I would challenge you to take a look at, first and foremost, how do you understand problems? What do you believe cause them, and what do you believe maintain them? The second is the role of reality in your conceptualization of client problems. Are these, is it our job to assess these problems from a function-dysfunction perspective, or is it our belief that what's maintaining the problem is this very subjective experience of the worldview? If we kind of look at how trauma memories are processed and how changes to the structure of the limbic system, like the enlargement of the amygdala that causes us to be hypervigilant and much more assessing of our environment for safety and danger, to where what one person would see as completely safe, another person may be terrified by. And so if our conceptualization of reality is the key is to begin to help people become more rational in their beliefs, we may really miss a great opportunity to help someone begin to recognize that their subjective view of the world as dangerous is really part of a biological process that comes from their experience of the world. So I would challenge you to begin to look at, where do you fall in that process? Number 3, how do you understand and conceptualize client resistance? And I think this falls very much within questions 1 and 2. And I always tell the story about the student that asked me, what's the best way to work with an unmotivated client? And I thought for a second, and my answer was, well, I don't know. I've never worked with an unmotivated client. That most of my clients are pretty highly motivated to stay the same. And that idea of, every client is motivated. The question is, what are they motivated towards? And so what we call resistance may, in their mind, make absolutely positive sense, in that the problem isn't them, the problem is their environment. The problem is the people around them. The problem is their spouse, their partner, their kids. And so if I were to answer the question that student had asked today, my answer to that question would be, not unfortunately, most of our clients are motivated to stay the same. I would probably say that most of my clients are pretty hardwired to stay the same. And I think that most therapists are pretty interested in neuroscience, but they don't really use neuroscience as a foundation to understand client problems, issues of resistance, issues of motivation. Our neural networks map how we see the world. Our neural networks come from our personal experiences of the world. And so, again, if we fall into the school of thought that epigenetics, the transgenerational transmission of problems, is really what's happening with the clients that we work with, that's going to create a very different set of therapeutic interventions than if we fall to the other side of that. Question number 4, how do clients change? What makes them decide to change? What's necessary for them to change? Students used to ask me all the time, what is your theory of change? And I would say that clients change when they realize that the problem that they're trying to solve isn't the problem that they have. And that they would always scratch their head. And the idea that I think, again, if we really believe in a neuroscience perspective, that how we are wired to see the world, that the solutions that we identify are always consistent with how we see the world. And that if we can help someone understand that the problem that they have is different, then that opens the door for an incredibly different set of solutions. Gregory Bateson, the famous anthropologist who became friends with Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, said the problem with most alcoholics is that they spend all their time trying to prove that they're not alcoholic. And that when they can begin to change that understanding of their problem from, I need to learn to drink socially to prove that I'm healthy, to, I have this illness and I need to start putting all my energy into trying to live in a healthy way with this illness. It shifts the worldview, and it shifts potential solutions that are life-saving. And so I would urge you to take a really good look at, why do you change? I don't change very easily personally. I think I'm pretty highly motivated to stay the same in a lot of my perspectives. And I would ask you the same thing. What does it take for you to begin to make major changes in your life? You're probably not all that different than your clients. And so, again, part of that process of coherence in our theory or practice is we don't ask people to do things that we're not able to do or that we're not willing to do. And so I think clients see through that pretty quick. Question number 5, what clinical models of therapy are most consistent with your theory of change? And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next few minutes. How important is the therapist's use of self in your clinical model? Think about in addiction counseling the role of self-disclosure and how often clients will think, well, I need to be in therapy with someone who's been through this process, and that if you're not in recovery, they tend to look a little more skeptical at you. And so this idea of self-disclosure, use of self, willingness to kind of talk about some of your own personal struggles. Again, different theories of practice are going to look at this in very different ways. And then the last is, how do you measure success in your clinical model? There's a lot of models of addiction that try to teach social use. Clearly, we don't adhere to that in the abstinence-based models of therapy. So if you look at these questions and you begin to kind of evaluate where you fall in those, it will probably give you a very good idea of where you fall in terms of your assumptive worldview, your clinical worldview, and your theory of change. And as you begin to look at the answers that you provided to these questions, there's another assessment that I want to introduce you to. And it's out of a book called Developing Your Theoretical Orientation in Counseling and Psychotherapy. And it's by Hauber and Hauber. And when I was teaching, it was the second edition. I don't know how many editions they have written or edited up to this point. But they had developed a kind of a questionnaire or a self-assessment that they called the Selective Theory Sorter. And what it does is ask you a series of 60 questions. And if you look at the first one, individual problems are best viewed in the context of a family system. And so you may either really strongly agree, and my PhD is in marriage and family therapy, so I would pretty strongly agree with that. So I would put a 3 in this open white box, but you may be completely opposed to that. And so you might put a -3 in that box. And so, but you may say, well, I think family work is really important, but I think individual work is equally as important. So you may put a 0 in that box. And so there are 60 of those questions. And again, these will lead you towards different theoretical kind of orientations, theoretical models, but they'll also be really helpful in helping you begin to look at your assumptive worldview. And if you really want to develop a solid assumptive worldview, the questions that you answer with either a 3, +3, or a -3, if you would circle those, and then at the end, take out another piece of paper and just really write these into like strongly believe and strongly not believe, and really begin to assess those questions kind of isolated from the others. And I think it'll give you a really clear view of what you believe about the therapeutic process, about the therapeutic relationship, and about interventions. And so, again, that gives you a really good solid of, this is your unifying theory. These are the things, these theories are what you use to help clients begin to change and grow. But this is what you base those on. And I think you'll see that as you go through these 60 questions, you'll get a very clear view of what theoretical orientation, the models are most consistent for you. And what you're going to find is that each of these A through L are different theoretical models. And at the end of the questionnaire, it's going to ask you to total each of the scores from each of these columns, and then put your scores here, and it'll tell you which models of therapy you are most aligned with. And so I would ask you not to look very much at these so that it doesn't guide your answers very much. And the models that you would say as your top 3, I would have you come over to this slide and put those in these boxes. And we'll kind of work off of those from this point forward. So this model, this self-assessment, I think is a really helpful way to get you to begin to look at theory in a slightly different way. Once you've done that, and once you have these kind of theories, I have always asked. So this is a textbook that I used when I was teaching the various theories courses that I taught at various universities, and I always liked Corey's book because in the appendix of the book, he did some integration of the different theoretical models in a way that I thought really helped to answer some of these questions. And so clearly, every theory has certain areas of thought that are compatible with your beliefs and certain other areas that are kind of incompatible. And so I would ask you to either use this document, or and I'm sure Corey has, he's probably on the 11th edition at this point. This is probably pretty old, but I'm using this more as an example. If you go to this model, he talks about each of the theoretical models, and they're not all the same from the selective theory sorter, but a lot of them are the same. And he walks you through this really fabulous process. So what are the basic philosophies of each of these theoretical models? And you begin to look at, you've already done all this work in identifying your beliefs. Then you can begin to look at, okay, this is a theory that when I answered the questions came up as the most consistent theory of practice with my belief systems and my kind of fundamental worldview. And then you begin to look at, so this is what Corey would say are the basic philosophies. So which ones of those are compatible and which ones are not compatible? And then Corey goes to the key concepts of each of those theories and begins to look at, like for psychoanalytic, normal personality development is based on successful resolution and integration of psychosexual stages of development. Is that consistent with what your beliefs are? Existential core concept, essentially an experiential approach to counseling rather than a firm theoretical model, stresses core human conditions. So kind of look at that model and just go through, what are the key philosophies, basic philosophies, what are the key concepts? Then he goes into, what are the goals? And are those goals consistent with what you believe the goals of therapy are? They should be. What's the therapeutic relationship? That question about the use of self. What are the techniques? What are the interventions? And again, once you've kind of begun to look at this, you're going to probably want to read more about these three therapies. Go to the seminal thinkers, the people who developed those, and begin to look at different interventions. And I was always of the opinion that if you could develop like a database of 3 or 4 interventions from each of these theories, that you'd have a pretty nice toolbox for being able to help clients with a wide variety of clinical issues. And then the last thing that Corey provides is this application of the approach. How do you use it? And so multicultural counseling, very critical part of every aspect of what we do. So how do each of these theories of practice actually look at multicultural perspectives, limitations in multicultural perspectives? So I think it's really a very nice way to begin to look at, what are the strengths of the approaches, what are the limitations of each of these approaches. So if you were to really take the time to walk through this process, again, answer the introductory questions, answer the questions from the Trescott self-assessment, you would have a pretty good handle on what your worldview would be about, reality, information processing, human nature. You'd have a great sense of your clinical beliefs, role of the therapeutic relationship, and the beginnings of your really kind of model of change. You would have a series of 3 theoretical models that you have kind of been shown are consistent with your belief system. If you go through and you circle those questions like I suggested, again, you'll have an even greater understanding of what within the therapeutic process is at the core of your kind of this triangle of assumptive worldview. And if you go through the Corey document or other books of your own choosing and begin to look at the models that are most consistent, looking for compatible areas and interventions, then you're going to have the ability to really develop a pretty solid integrated model of care. So I offer these tools to you as a way to kind of begin the process. I would be very happy to work with you in that process. So the next time we meet for supervision, if you can kind of take a look at some of this, we can discuss that and see how you want to move forward. So let me know what your thoughts are and let me know how you would like to proceed in this process. Thanks.